Who needs a national championship when you have a Pop-Tarts Bowl championship? Welcome to Big 12 Live right here at the Voice of College Football. Appreciate you stopping by. Of course, comments and questions are welcome. A bit of a change today. I had a lot of technical issues. Why StreamYard is disconnected to the Big 12 channel, I don't know, but it was too much to try to weed through last minute, so we're here on the main channel. But just to let you know, Mondays, each Monday, Nathan Brown right next to me from Big 12 Mafia. Nathan and I get together to talk Big 12 football every Monday, 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Central, where most of the Big 12, or at one point, the foundation of the Big 12 was located there in the Central time zone. But nowadays, everybody's in every time zone. It doesn't matter. Right below, of course, Levi Stevenson, host of our Iowa State show every Tuesday night at 8 Eastern, 7 Central.
That's right, 7 o'clock.
And then, of course, it's SB Nation with Wide Right Natty Light. Gentlemen, how we doing?
Good.
I'm doing great. Yeah, I'm doing great.
I imagine my BYU brethren up there is having a good time too.
Yeah, we're doing okay. You know, the Big 12,
right,
I think Big 12 came out of bowl season. I think there were 4 and 5 in total bowls, but they had some big wins. Iowa State and BYU had really, really big wins on a national scale that I think are going to bleed into this next year. So I'm pretty, happy where we ended up because Arizona State played so well. So
absolutely,
yeah, it's going to be a good 2025.
4 and 5 or 3 and 4, depending on how you count.
Right, if you don't count the BYU.
When you play each other, you can go either way on that one.
Technically, Colorado was the Pac-12 participant. So
yeah,
anyway.
Doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter.
One more year of seniority in the league.
That's exactly right. And that's why there are 0 SEC teams in the Final Four right now and 1 Big 12 team.
Yeah, and how ironic that is Texas, right?
Yeah.
And the 1 year separated Big 12 team. I think
it's the Big 12 that spent the last decade and a half getting wasted by the rest of the Big 12 because it shows up in the SEC the first year and goes to the title and then goes to the Final Four.
I think what we're seeing, though, is this power shift with realignment, transfer portal, and everything associated with those things, resources especially, it's filtering down. Let's be perfectly honest. The SEC isn't what it was supposed to be this year, and I'm not sure that's going to change a ton going into this next season. So I think the future's now for the Big 12 is just how do you capture that energy and turn around and do something with it?
I think the most important thing that we saw out of the bowl season now, I think a lot of people are seeing it. I mean, we in the Big 12 have seen it for a long time. I think national people are starting to see, like college football fans are starting to see it. I don't know that the people that are in charge are going to see it or will choose to see it. But as you said, the SEC is not head and shoulders above every other league. It's just not the case. And actually, really, even the Big 10 isn't either. Big 10 has a couple teams that are head and shoulders above other people. Like Oregon was so good this year. And then obviously Ohio State right now is playing. Nobody can touch Ohio State with how they're playing right now.
Right.
But the rest of that conference is certainly not head and shoulders above everybody else. So, and as my Oklahoma State friend over here too can attest, that the SEC and the Big 10 are just not head and shoulders above the ACC and the Big 12 like a lot of people said they are. And I'm hoping that this playoff and bowl season is starting to show. I don't think the bowls are going to shift anybody's opinion, but the playoff and showing how well Arizona State played and how poorly the SEC has done in the playoff, hopefully will create more narratives going forward to help us start to chip away a little bit at that legacy of the SEC of being just untouchable on top of the mountain type of thing.
Hey, Cody.
Football. Yeah,
hey,
Cody's
fellas.
Fellow Iowa State, Oklahoma State Drink Alliance member over here.
That might have been the perfect time to roll right into it, right? Because I'm assuming you were getting to the point of other conferences gaining more respect throughout the course of this college football playoff season. Arizona State obviously played well. There's been a lot of blowouts, which obviously is not a good look. And I would say perhaps we reimagine the idea of conference champions being one of the end-all, be-all circumstances that allow these teams to get in. I do think that it's pretty obvious that the SEC and the Big Ten have been somewhat exposed here. They've got teams at the top that are absolutely phenomenal, right, that should be in the position they're in. But the fact that you can go throughout the course of the season and the strength of schedule never gets an uptick, the RPI never gets much of an uptick, you have to show up for a couple games a year. To me, that's entirely different than even the Big 12 argument. I think there is an argument to be made that BYU should have gotten in, and had they have gotten in, the circumstances around the Big 12 would be viewed much more positively, just like if Arizona State would have won. But the bias around the SEC and the Big Ten, I'm hoping people are now seeing the fallacy exposed a little bit.
Well, how did the Big Ten get exposed?
Well, so I don't know that the Big Ten got exposed as much. I think if I don't know that it got exposed so much, but if you're going to say it got exposed, it's probably in the way that Indiana got demolished by Notre Dame. Like, it wasn't even close. So like,
Okay.
it's basically what it's saying is what a lot of people are saying for a long time, which is that the Big Ten is super top heavy. You got 3 teams at the top that are very good. No doubt about it. Oregon, Ohio State, Penn State, very good this year. Below that gets pretty soft. I think that's
you could say that about any conference.
Sure.
That would be my pushback there. My other pushback would be Notre Dame might be playing in the national championship game. So for them to defeat, now there are ridiculous people out there that were like equating Georgia's loss just because from a point spread value, it was more 13 than Indiana's 10. They didn't watch football, or they don't understand football.
Indiana got
that was obviously a competitive game. The Indiana game was not a competitive game. The only reason I'm pushing back on there is it was one football game, and I think we all understand that there are other teams in the Big Ten that are just as good as Indiana. They just didn't have the
and I think that's maybe what I think that's the exposed part. It's like I don't think the Big Ten got exposed the way that the SEC did. But I think it's mainly just saying that the Big Ten below those top 3 elite teams gets pretty soft, and where like Indiana, even with their 11-1 regular season or whatever it was, having an otherwise very good year for Indiana, them not being head and shoulders above the middle of the conference, I think is mainly what he's referring to. I would assume, saying that like even like that type of team that got in as an at-large just isn't that much better than BYU or Iowa State or even Colorado or something like that. I think that's maybe
just to finish my point. Just to finish my point, I think that the Big Ten could send Iowa or USC to South Bend, Indiana, and they would have played a better game than Indiana.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think Notre Dame's kind of a bad matchup for Indiana.
Is kind of what the exposure, I think, is the totality of the season, right? To get the advancement in the Big Ten, you do have to prepare primarily for 3 or 4 very big games. The rest of the season, I don't want to say a glorified scrimmage, but there's not very many instances where you're going to play the Northwesterns of the world and have a large opportunity to get beaten, as opposed to somewhere like the Big 12. And I'm not sitting here touting the Big 12 as one of the best conferences of all time, but I am saying it might be the only conference where number 14 can beat number 2, number 1 can lose to number 16. And it's not because the scheduling, it's because of the depth within the parity of the league in and of itself, which you do not have very much of in the Big Ten whatsoever. Obviously, you're going to have more from a size, speed, skill, strength perspective in the SEC. But I do feel like there is an exposure level of people realizing there's 7 or 8 wins in the Big Ten that are kind of built in.
So if I go around the room here, because I know where I stand on this one, what's a better conference, top to bottom, the Big 10 or the Big 12?
Top to bottom, Big 12. I don't.
So hold on. Let me clarify on this just a little bit.
Top to bottom.
Are you now when you're saying the top here? I mean, because obviously the top of the Big 10 is better. I don't think anybody would argue that. Are you talking about an average all the way top? Like the bottom of the Big 12 is
absolutely.
The bottom of the Big 12 is objectively better than the bottom of the Big 10. It's not even close.
Really?
Oh yeah, not even close. I mean,
who finished in the bottom? Who finished in the bottom?
They're not playing games against each other. How do
I know? But if you look at power rankings and everything, I mean, if you look at every metric we have available, that it points to that.
What is the?
Wow.
They're not playing games against each other for it to be objective.
Mark, who are the bottom 3 teams this last year in the Big Ten?
Purdue is horrendous.
And the other 2?
Probably this year would have been
Northwestern's pretty far
Northwestern and Maryland would have been the 3 worst teams.
Against Oklahoma State, Kansas, Utah.
Kansas
was like third last. Kansas was like they were down.
They went
way.
what,
Yeah.
3-6?
Yeah, or
Probably in the
4 and
conference.
7, something like that. Even though they beat
And I can tell you,
3 playoff teams in a row.
my BYU
But-
friend up there, and I can tell you, nobody wanted a piece of Kansas at the end of the year.
Well, I
I'm not
understand that.
questioning Mark. I was
Yeah.
just curious who those teams were, trying to
Yeah.
thumb it up in my head.
Yeah.
Sure,
Who would I take
probably.
between those two?
Yeah.
But I think we can both agree that it's easier to point out, just like it's easier to pick out the 3 best teams in the Big Ten, it's also easier to pick out the 3 worst teams in the Big Ten versus the 3 worst in the Big 12. And that's to the Big 12's credit to a certain extent. I
Yeah.
get your point. I have not argued this at all. I was touting all off season, this is going to be the most fun conference to watch.
And it was.
But I don't know if that speaks to national contention.
Well, and I think that's the thing, kind of what I alluded to before when I said I don't know if the right people are going to pay attention to the fact that the SEC kind of didn't look very good this in the postseason. I don't know if the right people are going to pay attention to that, but I think college football fans in general are starting to wake up to that
Sure.
a little bit and say, hey, by the way, the SEC did nothing in the playoff. The only SEC team that's still alive was in the Big 12 last year.
Well,
And
they're in the SEC now.
they are, but they still have a roster that was essentially built in the Big 12. But either way, that doesn't matter. But you're looking at Georgia didn't win, Alabama didn't make it, Tennessee wasn't competitive. You have all their top end teams that there. So that's kind of, as you're talking about like national title contention, the Big Ten has more year in, year out national title contenders. I don't think anybody would argue that. But if you're looking at the meat of the conference, right through the middle of that, where the largest percentage, where the middle 80% of the conference is, I would put the Big 12 right up against the Big 10, maybe just a tick higher, but it's certainly right on par with the Big 10 at least. I mean,
look, this is going to be a question that's going to be fought on the offseason, and I think all of us had really good points. At the end of the day, the Big 12's job is to almost, rather than shine the light as it compares to other conferences, more continue to talk about just elevating its own product.
Right
now,
yeah. I think Brett Yormark's done a good job of that, is just making it about promoting the Big 12 versus tearing down the SEC or the Big 10 or whatever.
Well, the SEC is coming back to the pack. I don't think there's any doubt about that. The only question is how many people are going to watch Ole Miss versus watch BYU, right? Those are numbers that people would need to sort out. And I think today those numbers would heavily favor Ole Miss. So because of that money follows power, and power is exhibited by viewership, and that really drives the programming. And the Big 12 still got a long way to make up. That doesn't mean we can't, but I think it's more important to say the contrast to the world that the SEC is the margins for the SEC to be extraordinary have come down so far that it's really closed the gap for everybody else. So it's I would still say it's the SEC, the Big 10, probably the Big 10 right now, at least this year. I think you could objectively
the Big
say
10's definitely better this
Big
year.
10, and then SEC, and then Big 12. I think the one that's the outlier that we all, and all, maybe you don't, Mark, but I think the Big 12 folks would sort of shake their head and can understand the ACC part of this.
The ACC is horrible.
Yeah, and
SMU
how the
getting
Big
in over BYU was crazy to me.
they're ahead because, frankly, all their teams are in the Eastern and Central time zones, and all those games are played before you get to the Western, right, or even the Central. And so that is probably the biggest challenge, is demographics favor the ACC. How does the Big 12 sort of take its product, which I think is objectively better, top to bottom, and promote it over the top? I mean, a program, and we're not ripping on people here, but we do have to compare and contrast, and comparing Wake Forest as a brand to Oklahoma State is silly. Those two, one has a pedigree, one doesn't. And one's never won 10 games or something like that, right? So you have real challenges that I think it's our job to draw attention to the Big 12 so the rest of the world sees it, and then say, hey, here we are. We're not going anywhere. Hello, Brett Yormark. I'm tagging you in every tweet I can think of. Step up, and you need to fix this in the offseason.
I think one of the biggest things that I don't think anyone has brought up yet, and maybe you have, and if you have, feel free to correct me on this. I think one of the biggest discrepancies that we're going to have to overcome is perception. And I think Drake covered this pretty masterfully last week. I know you're familiar with this, Nathan. Texas had a player that went from a 96 to an 85 by leaving Texas and going to the Big 12. There was a player from Nebraska, pretty comparable, was like a 92 overall, leaves Nebraska, comes to the Big 12, and they turn him into an 85. I think the national perception is propped up to some degree by the recruiting, but it's a numerical thing, right? So when Texas has a bunch of 92, 95, 94 overalls, that helps with the totality of their ranking in ESPN and all of that. And the minute that somebody leaves, even if they're starting, like Oklahoma State just had a starting corner leave LSU, come to Oklahoma State, and he got downgraded as well. Yeah. That is, I think, part of the biggest issue is that ESPN, right, they all have their dogs in the hunt to make financial compensation more alluring to these universities. And if we can't stop being honest about the recruiting numbers just to prop up certain teams and certain conferences, I think we're always going to have the same issue.
Yeah, I just outlined something. Go ahead, Mark.
I was just going to outline something Levi said that I want to be clear on. My retort was about Texas being a Big 12 member up until 2023. And then, of course, going to the it's a very valid point. Yes, they're technically in the SEC. Credit goes to the SEC for their advancement in the playoffs. But yes, this is a program that only won one Big 12 championship in forever. Just obviously it's last year in the Big 12 that was playing marginal football in the Big 12. Now it's a somewhat different program, but it was ascending in the Big 12 under Sark and and being pushed to the limit by Houston and Kansas State and fill in the blank, everybody else, even en route to a Big 12 championship. And then it transitions to the SEC, and it's kind of should be a feather in the cap of Big 12 fans to be able to say, that school right there, we know they won the Big 12 last year, but it was a tough struggle to win the Big 12, and they never were winning Big 12s before
we've
that.
We've been making fun of that program for 15 years.
And now they step in
they're
the
back.
SEC.
Yeah, get classic.
Well, and I think that's what people see. That's why the recency bias matters. If we stay very analytical, everybody saw they won the Big 12 last year, but they also knew the history of the previous decade. And it's not like they were blowing people out. Oklahoma State and Iowa State can speak to that because they had been beating them continually over the previous few years. So are they an SEC team now? Absolutely. I don't think anybody would deny. I think they were a top 5 recruiting class this last year. They're going to be top 5 again next year. They will have access to more resources and certainly better recruiting grounds overall. And they're still Texas. So I think Texas isn't going anywhere anytime soon. However, when we're talking is comparison to these other conferences and their best teams, I would have put, and I know I'm biased, but I would have put BYU, especially their defense, up against anybody. And I think they might have shown out better against somebody like a Penn State who likes to run the ball, and that's where the teeth of defense is for BYU. So I'm not saying they win that game, and I'm not saying Penn State doesn't deserve to be where they're at, but we have to sort of change the narrative. If the Big 12 continues to act like the little engine that could, instead of acting like we belong and we're here, we will continually be under thumb, and none of our schools will have better perceptions. We'll be here in 5 years, and that's what I'm working to change.
I'll tell you one thing, though, that happened that I think is a great first step in that direction. That was Arizona State. Maybe arguably should have won that game if not for that. The targeting, even the non-targeting that will go down in history. But
the 4th and 13 defense was brutal.
Well,
yeah,
I don't care. But shoot, after about 2 or 3 drives in the first quarter, they looked like the better team the rest of the game.
That's true.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can tell you first, Arizona State's a really good football team.
Yeah,
sure. That was one, and that was a team that was picked to finish last. And
last.
It was like consensus too. We're like, okay, Arizona State's gonna be crap this year. Yep. So, but then they just showed up, and turns out Utah's crap. But then it's you get Arizona State in there, and they probably should have won that game, honestly. And I think showing out against something like that did a lot of good for the Big 12 going forward, saying that, okay, I mean, and really no matter what, would it be better for the Big 12 to have 3 or 4 teams consistently hanging out at the top, and so you can kind of establish a norm there so people are used to seeing the same
yes,
music?
I would argue,
I think there's value to that argument. no matter what, though, no matter what that whole situation ends up being over the next 10 years, no matter what, whoever gets into the playoff needs to be competitive, or he needs to win games, or always be in games like Arizona State was, something like that. That's going to be the most important thing to putting legitimacy into all this, because Arizona State absolutely showed that they deserve to be where they were, and maybe even arguably deserved that they showed that they're worthy of that bye even. And I know the final score wasn't like super close, but like even you look at Boise State, they certainly looked like they belonged on that football for the Penn State.
Sure.
They looked very competitive, and that was even with them stacking the box against Ashton-Genty.
Well, and turning the ball over, 3 times?
Yeah.
I mean,
So like Boise State kind of hurt themselves a little bit too. So I mean, Boise State looked like they belong. Arizona State looked like they deserve the bye at minimum. So like all of this kind of combines to, I hope that going forward we can take the aggregate of what's been happening here and say, okay, there are competitive teams across college football now, because the transfer portal and NIL, as much as a lot of us really don't like how it is right now and it just kind of sucks for everybody, it is currently in the process of evening talent out across college football. It's creating parity across the sport that we haven't really seen a lot. And I think in the next couple of years, as revenue sharing and eventually a salary cap shows up, that will continue to level out the playing field. And then all of a sudden you don't have the Alabamas and the Georgias and the Ohio States and the Penn States and whoever else hoarding all of the blue chip talent from the past 3 classes sitting on their 2 deep. And it helps spread this talent out and makes more competitive teams across. And hopefully the people that make decisions start understanding that. I have no confidence that they will, because the people that make decisions in college football have their head buried in the sand as far as they can possibly bury it. And we alluded to, or we can continue to talk about that. I'm sure it will come up, and I'll bring it up right now, is that the effect of this going into next season too, like with BYU and Iowa State obviously both picking up very good wins, and Iowa State over Miami, and BYU the big win over Colorado, and notably over a Colorado that had its 2 stars playing for them, which is a big deal. And Iowa State playing against as full strength as Miami as you were going to get. And going into next season, ideally those same voters that are kind of too dumb to actually watch the games and really understand what's going on in college football, hopefully are also too dumb to go back and look at what happened in either of those games and say, okay, Iowa State got to win over Miami, BYU got to win over Colorado. And then that goes into the preseason poll, because for reasons known to absolutely nobody outside of the AP, we still have a preseason poll, and the college football committee, we still have a preseason poll that matters through the whole season, even into the college football playoff, because the preseason poll affects all of the polls leading up to that, and all of the polls leading up to that affect the college football playoff. I know Mark would, you do your, top 25 that actually makes sense every week and all that. I'm sure you would be a proponent. If I don't think anybody outside of the AP would miss the AP poll just going away entirely, or at least the first 6 weeks or something like that.
Actually, I think Big Ten and SEC would.
Well, yes, of course they would.
They will.
Of course it would, because they can't feed their narrative.
It's everybody else that wouldn't.
Right? Yeah.
I think people would miss it. Now maybe in this day and age of the internet, when there's 50 zillion,
there's 100 rankings
out there, then maybe they wouldn't, because everybody's got their own ranking.
Yeah,
now,
I mean, we've got
but I think people just, when we blame the rankings and that they're too early, I understand that it is too early to that's why throw out some ridiculous game or result, and that could happen in week 1. If so-and-so wins that game, they're going to be ranked, appropriately. In my, I've had Maryland number 3 in the country after week, whatever.
Right. But you don't do a preseason ranking though, right? Or do you?
People love rankings. So
sure,
they love looking at them.
It's internet fodder. Yeah. I mean, that's what it is. But
so we complain about it, but we are the ones that,
but we're also the internet. We're not the AP.
Going back to some of the discrepancies between conferences, Mark, if Penn State starts the season number 5 in the country, they're probably going to stay top 10 no matter what. They are, right?
Yeah.
There's no feasible scenario where Penn State starts number 5 and they might have Michigan on the schedule. They might have Ohio State on the schedule. But other than those 2 games, even they know if we start in the top 5, there's almost no way we end outside the top 10 by the end of the year. And that, I think, is a little bit of an obstacle.
I mean, if you start in the top 10 and win all of your games against a mediocre schedule, you're just going to stay in the top 10.
Oh,
whatever.
absolutely.
Like, I mean, look at Mizzou this year. They were a top 10 ranked in the preseason poll, and it took an extraordinary amount of mediocrity for them to fall out of the top 25. Even though everybody in college football that could watch Mizzou was like, this team sucks. They're not that good.
I don't know if they suck.
Well, they don't know suck, but they don't know suck. But they're not a top 10 team.
Not indicative of ranking.
This is not a ranked football team, and I don't know anybody that could watch Mizzou and come away with that.
I don't even necessarily agree with that, but we don't have to get into a deep dive.
It doesn't matter. But my point though is that look at how far overranked Mizzou was to begin the season.
So was Florida State. All sorts of teams get overranked.
Right. But that's my point though. Is that we when you look at the college football playoff, they looked at like ranked wins and stuff like that. It's like, well, okay, if you're gonna look at ranked wins, the only way you can get a ranked win in week 1 is if somebody is ranked in the preseason rankings.
Well, yeah, that's a dumb way to evaluate that.
It's a dumb way to evaluate, but they do. But that's my point, though, is they do. They still look at that. The College Football Playoff Committee looks at that, which is crazy to me.
I think one way to fix that would be, and I don't know, maybe you were going to say this, Cody. Sorry. I know you wanted to say something, but if you wait 4 weeks, 5 weeks to get the first official poll out, that will clear out a lot of those preseason, slough ratings that, persist through all the preseason. Mark's right. Rankings aren't going anywhere as an overall concept, but how they're initially introduced into the biosphere of an actual season, if we delay them 4 or 5, 6 weeks to get all the preseason muck games out of the way, and now you're dealing with a couple of head-to-head in-conference games every year, except for the SEC, which only plays 8 games. Then you can have a ratings that come out that, wow, somebody you weren't sure was going to be that good is up. Meanwhile, a team that you thought was going to be world beaters can't, beat Sisterhood of the Poor down the road. And that's what we need to start clearing out. Those are the things that are systemic that we could change. And the bottom part of that, what Cody said is exactly right. The FPI rankings for recruiting is broken.
Yeah, it's
absolutely broken, and
people look at ESPN recruiting rankings.
It skews everything. A lot of people don't know that the old BCS rankings involved some part of recruiting rankings in the preseason. So get rid of recruiting rankings altogether. Don't have that being part of either of the polls, and then don't start voting till 4th or 5th week. Go ahead, Cody.
I think Cody has a lot to say. I'm going to make one statement.
Yeah, you look like you're getting ready to explode.
We're going to let Cody cut loose. I got one statement to make. Actually, I believe if we're going to do rankings, every team in the country should be ranked. Why is there this magical cutoff?
Right.
There's nothing magical about being number 25 when there's a number 26.
Absolutely.
And I always love this. They're not ranked when a team's like number 28. Yes, they are ranked. They just stop the list at 25.
Yeah.
You know why we don't do that, Mark?
Votes, they're ranked just as much as the teams that are on the list. They're just number 26, 27, 28, 29. So I think every team in the country should be ranked, because once that final top 25 is released by the AP after all the games are played, all 4 of us could look at teams that are off the list, and make a reasonable argument as to why 10 of them should be ranked. Yeah, but they're magically, you're a bad team if you're not ranked. You're automatically a good team if you're ranked.
You know why we don't do that, Mark? Because the AP voters don't want to have to watch all the football games.
Well, and that's actually leading into what I was going to get to, because I think somebody mentioned whenever the committee, right, they showed that video of them watching the football games. You remember all that? That was just a few weeks ago. That was the most preposterous presentation of nonsensory I've seen throughout the course of the year. Most of those individuals were holding their cup of wine, looking around. They didn't even know what the heck was going on.
It was a
mixer. I think that is part of the problem. I remember when this whole CFP thing started and they were naming off people like Condoleezza Rice. I was like, well, that's kind of cool. Well, she went to Stanford, but what does she know about football? And furthermore, you know good and daggone well Condoleezza Rice is not sitting there every Saturday with anticipation waiting on Stanford or anybody else to play the game. If you're going to have a committee and there's not going to be a whole lot of analytical things involved in who's the top 12 teams in the country, the committee needs to at least be people that, A, don't have ties to universities that have, conference affiliations, and B, they need to be at least connoisseurs of the game, not meaning you have to be a former player. But if you don't watch college football, yet you're on some committee that decides who are the best college football teams in the country, That is absolutely preposterous. And to me, that's going to be another iteration of just feeding the haves as opposed to the have-nots, because even your non-football fans that are on the committee, they're going to watch Texas, Georgia. They're going to watch Alabama, LSU. They're probably not going to watch Arizona State, BYU. They're probably not going to watch Oklahoma State versus Houston. And I think unless there's guidance, right, on who's going to be in the committee and what the committee has to look at, this is always going to be an issue. I will say, though, it is pretty good for conversation, which is good for content, which kind of does help pay the bills. So I guess I'll deal with it.
Does
I
the
completely agree
AP want
with
to
you.
publicly admit that they're just farming content with the preseason polls?
Yeah.
They should. They
Yeah,
should
I don't-
publicly admit it.
What else are
actually,
you going to
Cody-
talk about in July and August?
I completely agree with your entire spiel right there, but I'm going to flip it to the reverse argument. On one occasion, going into conference championship weekend, the committee told us those games don't matter except for who won. Obviously, will advance, but the loser, we're not penalizing them. So my first question, if I was Reese Davis after the conference championship weekend, would have been, did you guys watch the conference championship games? And of course, they would have said, yes, of course we will. So my response would have been, why did you watch? Because you're not supposed to be, affected by the conference championship game results. You shouldn't even know the scores of the conference championship
Right.
games. You
You
should
see
only
that
know
movie,
Mark?
who won the conference championship. You shouldn't even have been watching or even know the scores of the conference championship games.
But we know that the scores do matter because we've talked about like, oh, BYU should have gotten it over SMU, which they should have. But the one you don't hear about is Iowa State should have got in, and that's because we got blown out in the Big 12 championship game, even though BYU and Iowa State had the same regular season record. So, theoretically, they should be like BYU and Iowa State should be in, and SMU and whoever, Indiana, should be out, or whatever, pick one. And, it's one of those. So, like, I mean, if we're going to sit here and pretend like they're not looking at the scores in the Big 12 in the conference championship games, like that's nonsense. They're obviously looking at that. I mean,
That's all they're looking at.
Yeah,
That's all. They're looking at the final scores, right, of the games they do
Yeah.
not watch, and they make a determination on that team predicated upon that
Well,
score.
it's like they like the college football playoff committee only really needs to watch 15 to 20 teams maybe or whatever. So I don't need the college football playoff committee to watch every game the whole season. I don't need them to do that.
but they can't make a determination on what 15
but-
teams are going to watch before the season even starts.
Right, that's exactly right. And the problem is that with the AP poll is that they can kind of do that, and because the AP poll says, well, we know how good all of the football team, well, at least the top 25, we know how good all of the teams are. But not only do they not watch most of the games, they can't watch most of the games because you just physically cannot watch that much college football, and that's okay. It's okay to admit that you have human limitations with how objective these rankings can be, which, I mean, I don't think anyone pretends that they're objective, but when they're being used as a metric to put teams in the playoff, that's a huge problem because it is a blatantly flawed metric that everybody knows is flawed. And it's nuts to me that we use that as a way to justify ranked wins for the playoff consideration and all that. It doesn't make any sense to me. But the people in charge and the people that make decisions are the people that grew up with the AP poll, and they grew up with AP national champions. They grew up with, a AP co-national champion LSU and Alabama in 2008 or whatever the year, 2005.
11.
11. Okay. Yeah, whatever. That it's a legacy institution of a college football that doesn't exist anymore. And I really wish that at least get rid of the preseason poll. Rank everybody after week 0 if you really want to, but don't do a preseason poll. That's silly. And like I said, I think college football fans are realizing this, or they have always realized this, depending on which conference you're in. But I don't have confidence in the people in charge making decisions to listen to any of this, to take any of this advice, that no matter how many people, reach out to them. I mean, certainly not on social media, but even like athletic directors reaching out and say, hey, by the way, the SEC had a really bad time in bowl season and in the postseason and was basically non-competitive as far as competing for a national championship. And all these other conferences did really well. why aren't we giving them the same credit? Because the SEC not playing 9 games in the regular, not playing 9 conference games is a load of crap. They need to play 9 conference games. If you want to load your conference up to the point where nobody can beat anybody on a regular basis because there's so many top heavy teams and it's impossible to come out of that with a really good record, then you still need to play the same number of conference games as everybody else. Otherwise, you don't have a leg to stand on when you're saying, well, look how much better our conference is. You have fewer gameplay matchups than everybody else. So you have fewer data points to stand on.
So does the ACC.
The ACC, it's
another thing.
tough.
Another thing that I've noticed that we might need to adjust is non-conference pretty much means nothing unless you're a team that's ranked at a specific spot. But how often do we see a team win in week 2 and they're a completely different team by the end of the season? Different running back, different quarterback, different linebackers. So I do think that some of the non-conference stuff needs to be factored into before the rankings come in. Because like Oklahoma State next year, we go to Eugene, Oregon week 2. Let's say that we shock the world and beat Oregon, and then Oregon wins every game the rest of the season. Is anybody at the end of the year going to say, well, Oklahoma State beat Oregon in week 2, therefore they're probably better than Oregon, regardless of what Oklahoma State's record is at the end of the year? Because Oregon could have a completely different roster by the end of the season, as could Oklahoma State. But the real question, Mark, I guess I have for you, you've been doing this professionally for most of your career. You've heard these arguments before conference realignment, after conference realignment. Do you think any of this is ever going to mean anything? Because the committees, whether it be the BCS or the CFP or whatever's next, they're always going to have their hand in it, and it's typically a hand predicated upon money. Am I wrong there?
No, you're not wrong. Obviously, it's a TV show. It's an entertainment commodity and resource, so that's what it is. It's a product. But it generally falls in line. You know, we did not see the committee elevate a team with a worse record over somebody else prior to the Florida State snub in 2023.
Right.
So we went 10 years of a playoff, 9 years of a playoff, where they basically went in the pecking order of the records. So Alabama, Ole Miss, South Carolina, the SEC did get left out of that spot. So they did, you know, for as much as I like to rail on the committee as well, and I do on a regular basis, most of all because their rhetoric is very inconsistent. You know, a lot of people say that they don't have criteria. That's not the deal. They have criteria. They just apply it differently to wherever they just use a different component of criteria wherever they want to.
It changes
so
week to week.
Let's give them credit for they did leave out the SEC out of that final spot this year.
Yeah, but there was also
that
an
means
easy
SMU should be thinking Florida State.
I'm sorry, what's that?
I think that means SMU should be saying thank you to Florida State getting snubbed the year prior. I feel like that has to have some semblance of a hand in it.
That part of it, I just wish that the CFP committee hadn't come out and put itself in a box the last week of the regular season, right before the conference championship games, where they said what Mark's already mentioned, and that is nobody will lose standing based on what the results are in these championship games. And I think that's where most people had issues with the final teams that were picked, because they basically had been declared, hey, we're not going to change you even if you look terrible. And the reason that is because of Florida State the year before. They didn't want to be accused of going through that again. And the last part of this is, what can we do to make this better? And there's a couple things. By 2026, they could go to 16 teams. They could go to reserved spots for conference champions, but everybody's seeded 1 to 16. No buys, right? Everybody goes out and plays home games in the first and maybe second round of the playoff. If they made all those simple changes, and maybe some objectifying to what goes into the 1 to 16, I think even though people will continue to bitch and moan who's team 17, who's team 18, that will never change. Yeah. I think that by itself, then people could say, hey, wait a second, you know, why for this team to be picked, we can look back at the record and say, well, the reason they were picked is their conference was objectively, I know you like that, Mark, objectively better than the conference that's being compared to. And I would love to go to a 4-4-2-2 or a 4-4-3-3 type format where these conferences are all given additional slots and it's not just 7 or 9 spots just picked at random. That we actually have conferences that now, instead of having conference championship games, you get rid of the buys. You have conference champions semifinals.
Yes, we
And
talked about this last time. I love
those
this idea.
teams,
I like
those teams come on, and we get rid of the championship games because nobody wants that extra game. And then it's basically a play-in, and everybody's playing the same number of games. And like Cody, and I don't know if Levi said this too, but going to 9, all the power conferences should be playing 9 games. I don't think there's any doubt about it. And
Absolutely.
I think the Boise State loophole will be sealed up. What Boise State did this year will never happen again, in my opinion. They're not going to get a 1 through 4 seed until they start playing majority power conference schedule. So
I don't know about you, fellas.
that's where I think we.
Well, I mean,
get.
Boise State got their bye because Clemson won the ACC, and Clemson had a fairly lackluster resume. I think in most years, had SMU won that title game, SMU would have got the bye, and Boise State would have got left out. So Boise State, I don't think necessarily got the bye 100% on their own merits. I think they got there partially because the ACC had kind of a weird sneak in in the playoff. They had a bid stealer in Clemson.
That's true. I still think that Boise State needs to play a tougher schedule. Their out of conference needs to be 3 or 4 power conferences.
Yeah,
Guys, they had Ashton Genty. Like,
Yeah,
it
they had-
only
they had
made
a
sense
player.
to highlight somebody like that.
Yeah, but I still don't think
Boise
they
State
deserve
showed
a
that they were
3
competitive
seed.
with Penn State.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
they didn't lose.
Yeah,
they,
but
didn't, they didn't get blown out.
Yeah, but a smart loss. Can we get rid of that as a term? Just, you only lost to Oregon, who got blown out by Ohio State, by the way. How does that loss now for Boise State look?
Nah, I don't like that because at the time Oregon had just beaten Ohio State.
Let's ask this. All 3 of us are Big 12 people, and Mark, you can answer this too. In the Big 12, what's Boise State's schedule?
Record-wise?
Schedule? Like what?
Yeah.
Like,
Where did they
give them
finish
the
out?
average Big 12
This
schedule.
year?
given the average Big 12
I'd say
schedule, I would
8-4.
have put Boise State probably at like a 9-3.
I think they're 8-14.
8-4, 9-3, somewhere.
And they're not 9-3 is not getting in the playoff either. So
no.
either one, my point is made, right? The strength of
why
schedule.
are we talking about Boise State though? They're a group of 5. The top group of 5 is going to make it anyway.
They are, and I'm not worried about them getting in the playoff. It was where they
It's
got
the bye.
seeded.
Yeah, and like I said, I think the
getting that
buy. I think
seeding-
they'll get rid of the. I think they'll get rid of the auto buys for conference champions.
I think just
Well,
get
they
rid of
need
all
to.
buys.
They should
out of
no
everything-
auto bids for conference champions. I think are a
That's
great
fine.
idea.
Auto
Make the
bids is
make the
fine.
conference championships matter.
No
But
buys.
Even if
Nobody.
they still allow buys, I personally, I don't know about you fellas, I want no part of a first round buy. Not only because
No,
I
I
do think
don't
that
either.
playing on campus is part of what's making this playoff atmosphere absolutely
The on
electric.
campus
And-
first round games were awesome.
Yep.
And secondarily, you're losing. I know from a health perspective, a lot of people kind of welcome that extra bye week, but all the teams that got a bye
Lost.
were not affected positively because they lost some of the momentum that they were carrying into that seeding, in my personal opinion.
Well, Arizona State got off to such a slow start against Texas, and yet the last 3 quarters of that game, they dominated them
Yeah.
for 3 quarters, except for the last play, 4th and 13. You could say
Yeah.
Arizona State was the better team on the day. I mean, they outgained them in yardage. They had less of those big break plays.
We do
So-
have to realize there was a quirky aspect to these buys that's pretty obvious. So it's not like I can buy into the argument that these 4 teams lost because they got buys and they were rusty. Ohio State might be the best team in the country.
But
Boise
you could argue
State's
that
not
Ohio
one of the
State's
best
first
teams.
game was
Ohio
a get
State
right
had had
game for them.
You know, Arizona State was the biggest underdog of the weekend, and even though they proved to be much better than that, it's no surprise to anyone that they lost the game. So I don't know that the bye had anything to do with the losses.
I don't know. 4
I
of
just
them
meant
are.
from a personal
It would be
perspective.
different if it was 2 and 2. I think 4. That's
They
a
were all
start
underdogs.
number.
Even Georgia.
Oregon wasn't an underdog.
Yes, they were.
Yeah,
To
they
Ohio
were.
State.
Ohio State was favored.
Oh, going into the game. I think going into the playoff, they weren't. They were the hands down favorite to win the whole thing going into it. After Ohio State
I don't remember.
beat Tennessee, then that narrative changed.
Ohio State has been favored by Vegas against Oregon the entire season, even after they lost to them.
Speaking of Vegas, I think an interesting thing here I've heard proposed, and I don't hate the idea, is that in the college football playoff committee, one member should be a person from Vegas. Is that, I mean, if you look at this playoff, the favorites are winning. Even lower seeded favorites are winning. I don't hate the idea of putting a guy from Vegas on the college football playoff committee, because those guys are very good at handicapping games.
The favorites 8-0.
It's because a lot of those individuals have connections, so they know about injuries and
stuff.
coaches defecting. Yes.
So like,
I agree with you. Yes.
I don't know if you necessarily would like get too crazy with them as far as selecting teams, but when it comes to seeding the bracket, I actually don't hate the idea of having a Vegas insider in as far as seeding the bracket to make sure that like the people we expect to win are the higher seeds type of thing.
I would be stunned if anybody would have gotten to the end of the season and thought Oregon wasn't going to boat race every team they played. I don't care what their point spread was. There's nobody that couldn't say they weren't going to score 50 points on every team. They'd already beaten Ohio State once in the year.
I picked Ohio State to win that game.
I picked Ohio State to win that game too, but that was after we saw them beat up Tennessee.
So let's
reverse them. What if Oregon beats up Tennessee? Does Oregon, are they favored over by Ohio State?
No,
I don't know. We can't say that.
I don't think Vegas is swayed by
Vegas likes Ohio State.
Okay, all right. We will never know. So it's not something to really argue about.
I guess one thing with the Ohio State thing,
I don't think Oregon State went into this playoff thinking we're the underdogs, or anybody thought that.
So like the thing with the first round game, I think there is at least some. I think there is some credence to the idea that the people that the teams that got first round games had a little bit of momentum going into the next game that the other team did not have.
Absolutely, they did.
Because if you look at, you look at like a team like Ohio State, it's a perfect example. Coming out of that Michigan game, everyone's like fire Ryan Day. Vibes couldn't have been worse in Columbus after that Michigan game, and then they go to they play Tennessee. They have a get right game. All of a sudden, Ohio State's back on the board. They're the Ohio State that we thought that Ohio State was going to be this whole time, basically. So now Tennessee is not an FCS and not an FCS team, obviously, but like that game was such a blowout that Ohio State basically used it kind of like a get back going game. And now you go into that Oregon game. Oregon had sat for a few weeks. They're not playing so many games that you're like that one extra game is going to wear on them physically so much where it's a huge disadvantage or anything like that. They're not playing that many games, but getting that extra game, I think, is not nothing. Is when you're talking about, having 2 weeks off or having 3 weeks off is a lot different than having 1 or 2 weeks off, as far as just kind of maintaining the general. I hate to use the word momentum because it's kind of a fake thing, but I mean, I think it matters a little bit, but the general feeling of being in a positive direction and having a good rhythm with everything. So for example, I do multiple podcasts now with former players, and every year when we get to the bye week, we talk about what's the strategy of the bye week based on how the season is going. I would say this year was undefeated going into the bye week, and we were talking about, okay, and they're really hurt. So I was like, okay, what are you doing this bye week to make sure that when you come back, things are either pointed in the right direction or you're maintaining or whatever it is. Every single player, every time you talk to them, all of them hate bye weeks. Every single one of them, they all hate bye weeks because it's a week off. You're just getting going and you're in a rhythm. You want to keep playing. You want to just keep playing week after week because you're in a rhythm. All of them hate bye weeks unless they have like a 2 week injury. Now they can come back the next game. But for the most part, they all hate bye weeks because they want to keep playing, and because you do lose rhythm and you do lose a little bit of that momentum when you have to take extra weeks off. So I don't think like getting that extra game at the beginning of the first round there is not nothing. I mean, did it change the Arizona State Texas game? I don't know, but I wouldn't say it didn't affect it because, like you said, Arizona State came out pretty sluggish. Texas really owned the opening of that game, and I think you could attribute part of that to Texas having played the week before.
So everything you just stated, Levi, and you, Cody, I completely agree with. Good points on the buys. The only point I'm making is it wasn't a case in which we said the 4 best teams in the country, or what we think are the 4 best teams in the country, received buys, let's say, who were generally considered the 4 best teams in the country entering this playoff? I would say Oregon, Ohio State, Georgia, Notre Dame, or Texas. Let's say all 4 of those received the buys and then lost. Then we would be like, what in the world happened here? This bye really screwed these teams up. But we're talking about 4 teams that all were the underdog in that game that they played in the second round.
Well, I wasn't necessarily talking about in context of whether it be changed or not. I was just saying selfishly as an Oklahoma State fan, I do not want a bye. I want an on-campus first round.
I think we are all on board with, we want to play a first round. Like, I would love nothing more than for Iowa State to host Tennessee in Ames for a first round playoff game. Nothing would make me happier. But as it applies to everything else, I think giving everybody the same path to the playoff, win 4 games and you win the national title type of thing, giving everybody the same path, I think is the right move. I don't think I think you can go to 16. I think you're good there. You either needed to be at 8 or 16. I don't really love the 12 team with buys. We need to stop pretending like anybody making decisions cares about how many games these guys are playing. Nobody cares. You're making stupid amounts of money.
People making stop. Excuses care.
Let's stop the charade that we care about the health of the players with how many games they're playing. Let's stop. And
kind of like the targeting penalty.
Yeah. I mean,
nonsense.
We don't need to go so far into that, but if that's not targeting, I genuinely have no idea what is.
I think it just accentuates you talking about there being a fallacy about this is all about protection of the players.
It's never been about. They don't care. Like, let's stop. But
they care. They care about preventing as many lawsuits.
They care about preventing lawsuits. Yeah. So I think you go to the 16 team playoff. You can do auto bids for do all the power conferences. And maybe even 2 G5 auto bids, but then no buys. You're seeding based on how good you think every team is. That's it.
2 G5s?
I don't think so.
Well, I mean, I'm just throwing out the idea. I mean, because if you look at Tulane was a very good team this year. Tulane, I don't know if they're not competitive with Penn State, but they can be competitive with an Indiana or something like that. I'm
give that slot instead of having Ole Miss, Miami, BYU.
I'm just tossing a funny idea out into the ether. I don't think it has any efficacy. We're never going to have 2 G5 auto bids. But
I don't think
what I'm saying is at 16 teams, you can get more creative with what you do with those extra 4 spots. And that's my entire point, is that because there was a while there the last couple of weeks of the season where the Big 12 fans were kind of secretly clinching just a little bit, making sure that everybody keeps winning out, and you have a 10-2, you have 2 10-2 teams in the title game, and just in case Tulane wins out and suddenly the American gets an at-large bid or something like that, and that's where it gets hairy. So that's that way, or actually because Tulane would have gotten in as an auto bid as the 5th highest rated conference champion. So the whole point though is you can get more creative with the end of that. I don't Boise State isn't going to be the only nationally competitive G5 team forever, but you'd have more flexibility to include somebody like that, or you can put Ole Miss in the playoffs so Lane Kiffin stops bitching. I don't know, and it's just I think you need to have an equal path for the number 1 seed and the number 2 seed and number 3, 4, all the way down. Everybody needs to win the same number of games to win a title, because it's just not great that right now you can win, all the buys lost, but that Oregon theoretically had to win 1 less game to win a national title. I don't like that.
I don't either. I don't like buys. They work in the NFL because the schedule overlaps so much that they're playing
there's so much cross-pollination
that you can say Kansas City Chiefs 15-2 are objectively better than the 11-6 Baltimore Ravens.
Right.
Therefore, they should receive a bye, even though they're both division champs. Where in college football, giving that much power to a committee to say, well, you decide who gets the bye. Well, it's not set up that way now with the conference champions, but obviously they had the power of selecting 4 teams for all that time, and now their power is in the selection of the
and in the NFL too, the quality of team, the difference in the quality of the team between the best team on an NFL team schedule and the worst team on an NFL team schedule is a lot smaller. That gap's a lot smaller than the gap on on Georgia's schedule, where they've got Texas here and then they've got who cares A&M from Division III Georgia somewhere down here. The gap between those teams is so much bigger than it is in the NFL. So like the cross-pollination, there's a lot more cross-pollination. That's why the buys work. But college, I think it's silly. You have to have the same path forward. Great discussion, folks. We want to make sure everyone knows where to find all of you. Levi, we'll start with you. My name is Levi Stevenson. I'm the managing editor for Wide Right Natty Light, which is Iowa State's SB Nation site. You can find us on Blue Sky and X and Facebook and YouTube and all that. It's just Wide RT Natty LT. Then my personal handle's below there, Levi R Stev. I'm not as active on my personal account as I am with the Wide Right account, but sometimes I would post about random stuff. But more importantly is that I host an Iowa State show on this very network Tuesday nights at 7 p.m. Central, where we every week we talk about the 11-win Iowa State Cyclones. Nice. Cody, thanks for dropping by. What's going on with you?
Yeah, not a lot has changed with me. You can still catch me essentially every day at the Locked On Oklahoma State show. I like to mix it up occasionally on social media at All Day O State on X.
Occasionally,
yeah. Me stirring the pot, Nathan. I would never dream of doing so. Oh, hey, man, guess what, Mark? I do have to say, football didn't go so hot. We're not super great at wrestling or basketball, but wrestling we are. When it comes to dudes wrestling other dudes, you got to come to OSU.
Nice. We're just going to forget Iowa State in here, the better wrestling program.
Levi,
not historically.
Drinking, my guy.
Not historically. It is 2:00 on a Monday, bud. That is, yeah, exactly right. Yeah. Well, Cody, sometime this offseason, we're going to have you. Well, we're going to have you back a bunch of times, but I mean specifically to talk just to me, because you're going to have to sell me on how Oklahoma State's going to be the greatest comeback story in college football in 2025.
Well, I failed you miserably this previous season, so I'm 1 for 1 here, buddy. Next year's got to be better.
Well, I'm not going to blame you. I'm going to blame Levi for letting me down because I picked Iowa State to win the Big 12. I didn't listen to you, Cody, so don't worry about it. I picked Iowa State to beat Kansas State in the Big 12 championship game, but they obviously let me down again.
It sounds like you've been talking to my wife. Good on you. Good on you, Mark. I wasn't tired. I don't listen to me either sometimes.
However, 3 cheers goes to Utah for being a pile of crap in every sport. Good job, Utah.
Yeah, they're not good at wrestling, dude.
They're not good at anything. We play them tomorrow night in basketball, and it's going to be a disaster. It's going to be a massacre.
Yeah, that's a storied program in basketball.
Is it?
Historically, it is.
Well, sure.
Oh, actually, funny enough, Iowa State's got historically has one Final Four appearance, and that was back when there was 4 teams in the NCAA tournament, and their first round opponent was Utah.
Yeah, Utah's until the last 12, 13 years where they sold everything to play college football for real.
Well, that went well
starved starved the basketball program. Sure. Pretty much everybody else.
Keith Van Horn.
Oh yeah. Andre. Miller.
I know
Andre
who you're
Miller.
talking about.
I was thinking legend Will Clyburn transferred from Utah.
Nathan Brown. We have a channel called College Football Mafia Network. Just look us up on YouTube. You can find me right there on my Twitter handle at B12 Mafia. And I've got a whole team, and we do exactly what Mark does here, just maybe not as slick as he does it. So I appreciate that we have these Big 12 days once a week. And thanks to everybody. Thanks, Cody. Thanks, Levi, for coming on. It's always a great conversation. So all of us just need to keep pointing to the North Star and selling the Big 12 no matter what.
Mm-hmm. All right. I give you the platform. I stay out of the way of you pointing toward the North Star. I'll just not.
Okay. All right. That sounds good.
Absolutely. We'll see everybody in just about an hour for our transfer portal update right here. Thanks for being here.
All right. We'll see you later. Bye-bye. Peace out.